Welcome. I'm Greg Paxton, Executive Director of Maine Preservation. Our organization works to preserve and promote historic places, buildings, downtowns, and neighborhoods, strengthening the cultural and economic vitality of Maine communities. Whether we are offering field service consultations, discussing protect and sell options to protect your property in perpetuity, or advising on historic tax credits, we are here to consult, educate, and advocate. First, I want to acknowledge the generosity of our preservation champions and the Weather Vane, Cupola, and Loft Gala patrons who made this event possible. We are incredibly fortunate to have the magnanimous support of so many individuals. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our year-long industry leader sponsors, Gleason Fine Art, Freeport Antiques and Heirlooms Showcase, Linda Bean's Main Kitchen and Topside Tavern, Northland Enterprises, Norway Savings Bank, and Ocean View at Falmouth. And our year-long underwriter sponsors, Bateman Partners, Consigli Construction Company, The Lincoln, North River Company, Waterfront Maine, Taggart Construction, and the Heritage Company Coppersmiths. And a big thank you to our lead event and supporting event sponsors listed in the program signage. Thank you also to our Gala Committee, Allison Prower, Betsy Henshaw, and Susan Axelrod, who spent the last few months diligently working to bring this event to life. Maine was the first state in the nation to ban the sale of alcoholic beverages in 1851. By 1855, 12 other states followed Maine's lead. At that point in time, there was a rum barrel in front of almost every enterprise in Portland, 300 places to get alcohol. And not only adults, but kids were often seen sneaking a nip. Portland Mayor and later National Temperance Leader Neil Dow led the movement to ban alcohol. And though after the Portland Rum Riots of 1855, the law was temporarily repealed and so was his mayoralship, but it was written into the Maine Constitution in 1885. Dow helped the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which led the charge nationally, and after his death in 1897, Dow's house in Portland went to them, which as many of you know they still own today. The Temperance Union secured national prohibition in 1919 until it was repealed nationally and in Maine in 1933. But tonight's event is the other side of the story. You might say recreational alcohol. Ned Wight, the founder and distiller at New England Distilling, based in Portland, Maine, will be hosting today's program, exploring Prohibition in Maine. His family began producing whiskey in Maryland back in the 1860s, and I'm sure he's glad he wasn't here then. And now, 6 generations on, Ned continues to produce whiskey in the style his ancestors did, starting over 150 years ago. Ned has been brewing and distilling professionally and otherwise for more than 25 years. His professional career began at Allagash Brewing Company in 1996. It was during his time at Allagash that he began to formulate a plan to open a craft distillery. He saw that plan to reality in 2011 when he opened New England Distilling, where they now produce 4 award-winning spirits: Ingenium Gin, 8 Bells Rum, Tidewalker Straight Bourbon Whiskey, and Gunpowder Rye. We hope you'll enjoy the program.
Thank you, Greg. I'm Ned Wight, founder and distiller of New England Distilling here in Portland. I'm very excited to be here with you all and hope you all enjoy the program we have and just explore some of the speakeasies and the history of Prohibition here in Maine. In the early 1800s, Americans drank large quantities of alcohol. Between 1800 and 1830, the average American over the age of 14 consumed the equivalent of 6.5 to 7 gallons of pure alcohol annually. That's 2.5 times the modern average of 2.3 gallons of beer, wine, or mixed drinks. The working classes usually received daily rations of rum, in some cases up to a pint, which they drank while on the job. Many believe that the tendency to turn to drinking was exacerbated by the increase in industrialization. Prior to this time, men had been employed in smaller shops with goals of eventually opening their own businesses. As mechanization and industrialization took off in the 1820s and 30s, these opportunities for independence diminished, and drinking became a tool to drown the sorrows they were experiencing from a lack of potential to earn a livelihood independently, but instead having to continue working demanding jobs as employees of others. Initially, early temperance organizations didn't call for prohibition. Instead, they wanted to find a way to redirect earnings from purchasing liquor to providing for their families. Moderate drinking in social situations was perfectly acceptable to these groups, who attacked things like drinking on the job and public drunkenness and trying to curb alcohol abuse in their communities. Their efforts were often part of a national trend that promoted community well-being through moral regulation. In the years leading up to Maine's prohibition of alcohol in 1851, it wasn't uncommon for businesses to have either barrels of rum or punch bowls out in front for people walking by for just a couple of pennies to take a scoop or a ladle full on their way to run their day's errands or wherever they were headed. Welcome to 10 Dana Street, which was formerly 1 Central Street and also known as James P. Baxter Block. Designed by the noted Portland architect Francis Fassett, the 3-story Italianate was constructed of brick with wood, stone, and metal trim and was built in 1879. 10 Dana Street was first established as Charles McLaughlin and Company, wholesale grocer, the oldest wholesale grocer in Portland. McLaughlin was a son of a wealthy family and established much of the waterfront in Portland, and later the town of Scarborough. Central Street, which is now Dana Street, was an extension of Central Wharf, which still exists much as it did back in the 19th century. McLaughlin's was well regarded in Portland and surrounding area for their promptness, accuracy, and integrity, and had the widest variety of goods this side of Boston. It was noted in the Board of Trade Journal in 1902 that better quality tobacco, tea, spices, and coffee could not be found anywhere else in New England. The 2 floors above the grocer had numerous doctors' offices where tonics and medicines were prescribed for whatever ails you. Central Street has a long history as a legitimate business in Portland's seafaring story. However, there are 2 sides to this historic building. The back entrance opened to Plum Alley, now known as 36 Wharf Street, an extension of a long-forgotten Plum Street. Plum Alley's main purpose was to run items from the ships on Central Wharf to the backside of the buildings of Central and Plum Streets. Now, this lost Plum Street housed 2 of the finest hotels in Portland and was once central enough to the heart of the city to hold the library and other congressional buildings. This area was also considered part of the robust Italian community settled here in Portland. It was noted that the hotels of Plum Street were often filled with rowdy Italian seafarers. The back room of 10 Dana Street was known as a chart house, no doubt the first stop where seamen would gather to replace and repair equipment needed for their next voyage at sea. Perhaps a place where the seamen would grab items not sold in the front of the store to relax their spirits, allowing them to indulge and wander the cobblestone streets that are the cornerstone of the Old Port. They would sing loudly with their feet on solid ground as they wandered down Old Plum Street before finally resting their heads in long-forgotten hotels.
My name is Morgan. I'm the lead bartender at Vecchia in Portland, Maine. And we're here at our back bar today to discuss 2 classic cocktails. The first is the GIBSON, which is a riff on the most iconic cocktail of the 19th century, the martini. But in place of an olive or lemon twist traditional garnish, we use a pickled pearl onion. Now, the origin story of the GIBSON is a little muddled. What we do know is it first appeared in William Boothby's World Drinks and How to Mix Them in 1907. No mention of the garnish there, though. There are 2 people named Gibson that have laid claims. We have graphic artist Charles Dana Gibson, who was said to have asked for a pearl onion in place of the traditional lemon or olive at the New York social club, The Players. Contrarily, we have a San Francisco businessman, Walter Gibson, who supposedly slipped an onion into his martini, believing it to have preventative qualities over a cold. We also have a firm belief in the preventative and restorative qualities of spirits in this building. The traditional build on a Gibson involves a London dry gin, a French dry vermouth, optional addition of bitters, typically orange. It's then stirred to proper dilution, served straight up with a cocktail onion. For our house build on the Gibson, instead of the pickled pearl onion being an afterthought, we've chosen to make it the main flavor component of our beverage, using the savory element to stretch through all the ingredients we use to make it 100% ours. We use Beefeater, a London dry gin, to add a nice bright citrus component to the beverage. Additionally, the Carpano dry vermouth is infused with charred cipollini onion to add a sweet, smoky element to the beverage. We then use Amontillado sherry and Berto Aperitivo vermouth to add some dryness and herbaceousness to the cocktail. Lastly, we use a celery shrub and Scarborough bitters, which is parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, using additional salinity to tie all components into a 100% savory cocktail.
While Prohibition officially began in the United States on January 16, 1920 with the passage of the Volstead Act, Maine's own history with Prohibition began in 1851 when Mayor Neal Dow, considered the father of Prohibition, banned the manufacture and sale of liquor in Portland. This ban remained in effect until the Volstead Act was repealed in 1933, ending the United States' foray into temperance. Maine's early ban on alcohol, the first in the nation to do so, also meant that Maine got a head start on circumventing Prohibition. Some saloon owners openly disregarded the ban. In fact, in Bangor alone, between 1871 and 1904, the number of saloons in the city increased from 11 to 67. It wasn't just saloon owners who brazenly ignored Prohibition either. Citizens of Bangor also flaunted the law, and nearly 50% of all arrests in Bangor between 1871 and 1904 were for public drunkenness. Next, we visit Bramhall in Portland. Designed by the noted Portland architect Francis Fassett, the Rhines Mansion was built for J. Henry and Anna Isabel Rhines in a brick mansard style. The couple took up residence there in 1887 and over the next 4 decades entertained Portland's leading residents and dignitaries from away. Members of the Rhines family controlled a business empire that included the Rhines Brothers Company department store, the Congress Square Hotel, which later became the Eastland Park Hotel, as well as radio and television stations. The Roma Cafe opened at 767 Congress Street in 1935 and was owned and operated by Dominic Marino, who had emigrated from Italy. The story is that Marino had originally opened a speakeasy in Detroit and then opened the basement bar upon moving to the former Henry Rhines mansion. Marino's sons, who purchased the building in the 1980s, did most of the brickwork in the basement. They wanted it to match the look of the original period the building was built in, so used bricks from 100-year-old buildings that were being torn down. During this time, they also installed doors from the Longfellow House, as well as stained glass salvaged from various areas around Portland.
All right, my name is Matthew Kurt. You are at Bramhall Pub on Congress Street in Portland. Funny, when I first moved to Portland, Bramhall was the first pub I actually shared a drink in and fell in love with it. Little did I know I was going to be working here. It was actually a speakeasy back in the day. Atmosphere down here, speakeasy feel. People love it when they walk down the steps and get a walk in a dark building and have a drink. Roma Cafe upstairs, more of a refined Italian cuisine, family style. Represents the dining in the house when it was a home back in the day. A little bit about the story. Right behind us right here would be the heating system for the home that was built in 1889. So original bricks from all over Portland from the fires and also buildings that were going to be torn down. And the archways were built to represent what the building would have looked like back before it was remodeled. Behind our bar for fun, we have the bear claw tubs that would have been common in a lot of speakeasies. The home itself was the Rhines family, and they moved in 1889. Mr. Rhines owned department stores, and also, funny enough, what is the Eastland Hotel. Same designers built his home while they're building the hotel. They lived here, we think, up until 1920 something, right before Prohibition, when the Merinos took over. Roma Cafe opened in 1924, but down the street in Congress, and moved into the home as a restaurant in 1935. When they opened the original Roma in 1924, this building, we speculate, was bought by them in the 20s. So the Merino family was running the speakeasy under this home. So once the Merinos opened up in the home as a restaurant in 1935, the whole time they're actually having a speakeasy below. Not only liquor spirits, but who knows what you'll see on camera once you finish filming. Down here, we think we have a different entity than we do upstairs. Things do move all the time down here. Lights will be flashing every once in a while. Let's say Roma was closed upstairs, you can hear chairs moving across the floor. Upstairs, we believe the spirit upstairs is actually Mr. Rhines himself. And if you're walking by the grand stairway, the most common thing is if you're walking by, you'll see him on the landing in a smoking jacket, and that's what everybody will see if they see it. The one down here is playful. He will throw bottle caps at the bartenders and they think it's the other bartender, but no one's behind the bar with him. Upstairs, he could be a little ruckus every once in a while. Smashing bottles, smashing mirrors. Yeah. Turning the water on you in the restroom when that happens. But don't let that scare you coming in to eat, because that only happens after hours. The history of the cafe upstairs is amazing, because if you think about 1924 all the way up to 2008 is when they closed the doors as Roma, the original. The history of sons, grandparents having their weddings here, the graduation parties, the romantic dinners. I still hear that all the time. I celebrated such and such date back in the 80s or the 70s, 60s. So that's pretty neat. And that's nostalgia upstairs. And then it's the same, oh, we used to play darts downstairs in the 70s. So you get that quite often. And the owners, Mike Fraser and Leska, they wanted to keep that spirit of the building, be the pub downstairs and then also the restaurant upstairs. So we have both the original signs out there. All right, welcome to Bramhall. We were talking about the lone wolf. We're gonna fire up some lavender for you, get that smoking. This cocktail is done with bourbon, Antica infused Earl Grey. While that smokes, we just pull it in here for you. Most of our cocktails are a little process to them, but this one, since we've infused the Earl Grey, I am going to stir that up for us. Get that smoking. I wish you on camera could smell right now, because this will actually sell the cocktail by itself, and so the menu if people see it. Ice cube. Doesn't need a garnish because this nice smell of the lavender with that bourbon will make it just fine. So cheers, come down to Bramhall and visit Roma before.
Neil Dow is considered the father of Prohibition, passed the Maine law in 1851, which barred the manufacture and sale of alcohol in Maine. 4 years later, in 1855, rumors began to swirl that Dow was holding a large supply of alcohol worth about $1,600, which is about $45,000 in today's money. What this rumor didn't spell out was that Dow had authorized this purchase of alcohol for medicinal purposes and for manufacturing use. And it was to be distributed either to doctors, pharmacists, or other industry around the city. Many citizens of Portland had been critical of the Maine law since its passage, with Irish immigrants perhaps being the most vocal critics of the law. One stipulation was that any 3 voters could apply for a search warrant if they suspected someone was storing or distributing alcohol. So, when 3 local men appeared before a judge to issue a search warrant for Dow's alleged supply. The judge complied. And on June 2nd, 1855, police executed the search warrant of City Hall as a crowd of over 200 Portland residents gathered. The crowd grew larger and more frustrated as it became clear that the police were not going to seize any of the alcohol. By nightfall, it's estimated that between 1,000 and 3,000 folks had gathered. Portland had a population of about 21,000 at the time. They began throwing rocks, began getting aggressive, and when it became clear that the police couldn't control the crowd, Dow ordered the militia to intervene. The militia fired into the crowd, killing 1 man, John Robbins of Deer Isle, and injuring 7 others. The Maine law was repealed following the Rum Riots, but was reenacted in various forms until it was codified into Maine's Constitution. Blind Tiger occupies a federal-style mansion house on Danforth Street in Portland. The home was built in 1823 by Joseph Holt Ingraham as the Danforth Bed and Breakfast Inn. Later, in between 1899 and 1901, it was used as a private boarding school, the Portland School for Girls, which soon relocated and became the Waynflete School. After this, Elias Thomas took control of the property and took the opportunity to remodel the home for his family to move into. John Calvin Stevens supervised the colonial revival style renovations. The original footprint was expanded to better accommodate lavish gatherings and host many guests. Upgrades included making sure that all of the light fixtures were equipped for both gas and electricity, and he also designed decorative tiles, carved mantels for each of the 12 fireplaces. Other details included leaded glass windows, baccarat glass doorknobs, and bowed walls. This is also when the wood-paneled billiard room with built-in cue rack and perimeter seating was added to the basement of the building. Elias and Dorothea Thomas, along with their 7 children, entertained frequently. The family's dining room table had extra leaves to seat 24 people. To the neighborhood, this location became known as Social Corners, even as Prohibition forced festivities to a secret room in the basement. Elias Thomas was a merchant and owned a number of buildings in Portland, along with relatives W.W. and H.T. Payson. Their close ties to Portland's downtown likely led to a hearty social life, hence the development of the room in the basement to host their friends and acquaintances. By 1941, Elias had died and most of the children had left home, leaving Dorothea and her daughter Julia in a home too large for 2, so they sold it to the Catholic diocese for $10,000 to be used as a rectory and church offices. 163 Danforth Street resumed its original life as an inn in 1993, again becoming the Danforth. The stately building has been meticulously maintained for nearly 200 years, and in 2020 opened as the Blind Tiger, highlighting the historic character of the building by preserving early features like the rooftop cupola that offers panoramic views of the skyline and harbor, and the hidden billiards room in the basement to continue entertaining guests for decades to come.
The Blind Tiger is really unique for a multitude of reasons. One being the story the building tells itself. You can tell this space was made to gather, and taking that into consideration, it's another thing that makes staying here a unique experience. My name is Tamara Croman. I'm the general manager here at Blind Tiger Guest House in Portland, Maine. The Blind Tiger is a federal-style mansion built in 1823 by Joseph Holt, turned guest house now. It's a beautiful home in the historic district. In this part of Portland, in this neighborhood, there's a lot of historic homes, the beautiful brick with ivy up the sides. You'll notice that throughout the area. The interesting thing about Blind Tiger is once occupied by the Thomas family, and they were very social. They were known for throwing large, lavish gatherings and kind of filling all of these spaces with some lively social activity, so much so that they actually expanded the home at one point so they could fit more people in from the neighborhood. It just was this great gathering space. It was actually known as Social Corners, so people in the neighborhood would reference the home by that name. At the Blind Tiger, we wanted to carry on the tradition of having that sense of community and gathering and celebrating the history. So we did that through design. You'll see all of the elements of history have been kept, And in fact, they have been highlighted by the paint colors, the woodwork itself, keeping those fundamental historic pieces alive and celebrated. The Blind Tiger skirted Prohibition because of the willingness and the want of the neighborhood. This speakeasy was really a community for those trying to find a resemblance of normalcy in the changing world. You could find neighbors, people from throughout the town. Those were the clients that were coming to visit, and it was their want and what they thought as need for the time that kept them quiet and kept Blind Tiger running smoothly. We are so lucky that Blind Tiger has been meticulously cared for. I believe it's sheer luck that the owners always appreciated the history and the meaning of the building in the neighborhood. It was a family home for many years, a boarding home at one point, and then a restaurant and inn. And so throughout the years, people have really focused on caring for the original woodwork and the details that make it so special. And when we have taken over and created the Blind Tiger Guest House, it was top priority for us to really show how much we care. When the owners were renovating this home, they really wanted to tell the story. That was the forefront, most important thing for them. And they thought the best way to do that was in the name. The name Blind Tiger was actually a reference for a speakeasy back in the day. So they would literally say, "I'm going to the Blind Tiger," meaning they were going to visit a speakeasy. And when we heard that reference, we thought it was the best fit for the home. Portland as a city is really unique. It has all of the amenities that you would want in a big city, but it has a community feeling, like you're welcomed into the neighborhood. Another tradition we really wanted to keep alive here at Blind Tiger was connecting with the neighborhood. So we've partnered with a couple local people and businesses to make them a part of this experience. We partnered up with Little Giant, which is a restaurant just down the block, and created a secret cocktail there called the Blind Tiger. It's a really unique, flavorful cocktail. It has moonshine, scotch, ginger, and blood orange. So it's some classics with a twist. It has its own flavor, and that's really what Blind Tiger Guest House is too, in Portland as a city. We are so excited for the future of Blind Tiger Guest House. We so look forward to hosting our community members, our neighbors, and really bringing that gathering space and that community sense back into the home. We're planning to do restaurant pop-ups, inspire some artists, anything we can to really create that feeling of welcoming neighbors. We want everyone to visit. We really want the sense of community to come back to life in this house.
Maine became a major center of bootlegging due to its proximity to Canada and the access of Maine's ports. Rum runners would bring alcohol over from Canada, often hiding their contraband in bales of cotton or boxes labeled Bibles or other legal beverages. In Maine, specifically, liquor was often disguised as a bottle of Moxie. Rum runners used specially outfitted boats with airplane engines that could travel much faster than the Coast Guard boats at the time. Their destination was often Rum Row, a line of Canadian fishing vessels that were set up 3 miles off the coast of the United States, where rum runners could buy alcohol and then bring it back into port to sell. The rum runners had the upper hand on the Coast Guard until 1923, when the Coast Guard began purchasing their own speedboats. Still, it's estimated that for every one rum runner that was caught by the Coast Guard, at least a dozen others got away. And this whole interaction here is actually part of the origination of the term the real McCoy. Captain William McCoy was a rum runner, and he would ply the New England coast, going down to the Caribbean to pick up rum, or off of Newfoundland to buy whiskey and things along those lines. Then he'd park 3 miles offshore, which was the demarcation of international waters at the time, and that was actually changed to 12 miles during Prohibition. So McCoy would be parked there just outside of that 3-mile limit, and fishermen from Maine would come out in their modified boats, meet up, pick up the alcohol from McCoy and bring it back in. And since that was alcohol purchased from other areas of the world and not produced, by questionable means here in the state, it was considered high quality, and so that is why it was called the real McCoy. It was a note of quality for the bootleg booze. Kimball Block, built in 1848 by Ito K. Kimball, sits on the eastern side of Main Street in Rockland. The grand three-story building was home to 6 stores on the first floor, offices on the second, and ironically, a chapter of the Temple of Honor and Temperance on the third. The Temple of Honor and Temperance was nationally established in 1845 as the Marshall Temperance Fraternity as part of the overall national temperance movement. Sadly, in 1853, a fire broke out in the attic of the north half of the Kimball Block at 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve, and most of the contents of the stores and the offices were destroyed. The attic is what later became the Speakeasy. As we explored around the building, we spent some time sifting through a closet at the end of the hall on the 3rd floor, finding numerous boxes of matches, a box of tobacco, a pair of shoes, a newspaper from 1929, as well as letters, correspondence, and a Rockland Savings Bank account log belonging to an E. Dow Jones dated 1929. The irony of the name lingered with us a bit. These contents hint of a possible boarding house on the 3rd floor of the Kimball Block in the 1920s. The life of the building during the early to mid-1900s is vague, but the signatures on the wall whisper of rowdy evenings and good times.
The first time I stepped into the upper floors of this building, I was struck with awe. It's a pretty incredible thing to see something untouched for a century, and not just untouched, but left with newspapers and photographs and postcards and matches and boxes of tobacco and typewriters. You can see a snapshot of what life was like. My name is Jennifer Rockwell. We are in historic Midcoast, Maine, downtown Rockland. My family owns the property here at 435 Main Street, and we are part of the revitalization of historical Rockland. Restoring downtown Rockland is a passion project for my family. My family immigrated from Eastern Europe to New York and ended up in the fishing business, which led them to Midcoast, Maine, where they started Port Clyde Sardines. Midcoast, Maine has been such an important part of my family history, and that's really what led my family to pursue projects in Rockland and in restoring the history and revitalizing some of the incredible buildings and spaces that once existed. When the building became available, my father and I thought of what could be in downtown Rockland. The story at 435 Main Street is still widely unknown. What we know is what we see. There's a lot of clues that lead to the fact that this was a speakeasy back in the Prohibition era. When the previous building owner turned the building over to my father, Richard Rockwell, there were hundreds of medicine bottles from Long Island, New York, and Boston, a lot of unmarked bottles as well. Different labels on there saying that it'll revitalize your health. That's kind of a clue that there was definitely something going on here. There's writing on the walls, there's hundreds of signatures. Great night in Rockland, Maine in the 1920s. Who knows what that great night was? 2020 was the 100-year anniversary of the Speakeasy. It is really interesting that 100 years later we can kind of revisit the Speakeasy and revisit our relationship with the consumption of alcohol. And we have a bar downstairs next door. We don't have to hide it anymore. What makes it unique today is that it still shows every piece of history from its inception. You can see just through the wood beams, fires that have happened in the building from more than a century ago. Different building styles and materials, they all still exist here. Revitalizing an old building is a lot of work. You have to do it properly. You have to make sure that any new work that goes in to this building will be properly put back together to last for another 200 years. When you walk through this space, you feel the history. You can see the history. Seeing how things were built a century and a half ago and seeing it still standing today, being able to sit here 200 years later is a remarkable thing. As we look towards the future, we hope to bring life into this building. In every project, recognizing our history is important in building the future.
Once liquor came ashore, the barrels or bottles or cases or whatever were usually stored in some safe place, generally on wharves and piers where containers could be stored either on like specially designed ledges beneath the structures or under piles of other things. There's actually a great story where apparently a signal was supposed to be set up where you would light a bonfire to tell the boat where to come ashore and stash the booze. So they lit the bonfire not knowing that the rum runners had already brought the delivery ashore and hidden it under the same pile of brush that they had just lit a fire, and they ruined their entire allotment of booze. Folks would stash away their liquor in closets or in furniture and in flasks. In fact, during Prohibition, sales of flasks in the US rose something like 11,000% versus prior to the passage of the Volstead Act. Confiscated liquor would be stored in rum rooms, which were established in all of Maine's 16 counties. One of the largest of these rum rooms was in Portland City Hall. And once a month, city officials would host dumping parties, and they would invite local newspapers to witness the officials smashing bottles and things like that. What we always see in those images of people, you know, with their axes busting open barrels of beer and smashing bottles in the gutters. Sad, sad days.
Our next cocktail was the signature drink of Erskine Gwynn, an expat writer, socialite, and nephew of railroad tycoon Alfred Vanderbilt. Gwynn moved to Paris, where he founded the literary magazine The Boulevardier, which gives this cocktail its name. The classic Boulevardier uses equal parts bourbon, Campari, and sweet vermouth. The Boulevardier is a riff on the classic Italian Negroni. We first see the Boulevardier in print in Harry Macalone's 1927 Barflies and Cocktails. Macalone moved to Paris to open the world's famous Harry's New York Bar after being displaced from the Plaza Hotel during Prohibition. For the 5 Points cocktail at Vecchia, we have a base of green coffee infused bourbon, which uses unroasted coffee beans to lend an herbaceous tea-like element. We then use the traditional bitter Campari, accented with Amaro Habano, providing familiar warming spices such as cinnamon and cardamom. The bitter vermouth Punta Mace allows us to use local maple syrup, finished with a dry Oloroso sherry, giving depth and complexity to round out the bill.
Hello, I'm Ned Wight. Welcome to New England Distilling. I'm one of the founders. I started the distillery back in 2011. I come from a long line of distillers. I'm the sixth generation in my family making specifically rye whiskey. So back in the 1860s, 1870s, my family got involved in rye whiskey production down in Maryland. A state we don't typically think of as a whiskey producing state, but back in the mid to late 1800s, whiskey was really being produced on the East Coast. So states like Pennsylvania and Maryland were big rye whiskey producing states. So they produced rye whiskey in a town called Cockeysville up until about Prohibition. They sold alcohol to the military. During Prohibition, they sold medicinal whiskey, and then they started up again in 1934, post-Prohibition, started producing on the Gunpowder River, which is where we get the name for our rye whiskey, Gunpowder Rye. So today I'm going to show you a little bit about our distillery, how we produce things, a little bit difference between the different types of alcohol. So we produce Ingenium gin, which is a Holland-style gin, and what that is it's a style of gin that predates the London dry gins that we're most familiar with. Now, Holland-style gin comes before the London dry, and it just really starts off as more of a whiskey base. So you have a sweetness to it, a little flavor of the grain, and then a little less juniper note, other botanicals in there in the background. We produce 8 Bells rum. Now, rum has to be produced from molasses. So we've got a bottle right here. Molasses is a waste product of the sugar refining industry. So back when the US was when we were colonies, this was a major commodity in the US, was bringing in molasses to ferment because it was dirt cheap. It was very expensive to bring in brandies and wines from Europe, so they produced what they could here and they wanted to do it cheaply. So ships could bring molasses back as ballast essentially in ships, and it could be fermented here and then distilled into rum. We also produce a variety of whiskeys. We produce a bourbon and a rye whiskey, and those are the two really original American whiskeys. What defines them is what grain makes up more than half of the base of that whiskey. So in the case of bourbon, that's going to be at least half corn, so minimum of 51% corn. And rye whiskey, which is America's really first whiskey, that has to be at least 51% rye. So we use a combination of rye, barley, and in the case of the bourbon, rye, barley, corn, and wheat. So once we have our raw material, whether that be barley or rye or corn or molasses, we're going to take that and ferment it. So that's where we'll convert the starches in the grains to sugars. Then we'll add yeast to that. The yeast will ferment the sugar and create alcohol, a bunch of different flavor compounds, and carbon dioxide. That'll take us anywhere from 3 days to about 2 weeks in the case of the rum. When it's all fermented out, we'll separate out the grain. The grain will go off to a farmer to use for feed, and what we're left with is what's called a distiller's beer. It's a slightly sour, very yeasty, totally flat beer. It's not awesome drinking beer, but it's good for distilling. What we'll do is we'll then pump that into our stills, and a still is just a large sealed pot with an outlet, and then a way to, that outlet will lead to what's called a condenser. So what we'll do is we'll fill the pot with beer, we'll heat it up, and that's one thing that we do very traditionally here. We heat over open flame. It's very common nowadays to heat with either electricity or steam, which is a very mild heat. We're looking to recreate some spirits that you would have found more commonly in the 1800s and even back in the 17 and earlier hundreds. So what we'll do by heating with natural gas, we get incredibly intense heat along the bottom of the pot, and there we're driving caramelization reactions, Maillard reactions, which are these very complex chemical reactions that develop rich, deep flavor. So we'll bring our beer into the pot, bring it up to a boil, create all those flavor reactions. As we're boiling, the alcohol is going to evaporate off. It boils at a lower temperature than water. So it'll evaporate off, it'll rise up in the pot, and as it rises up, it's directed into a pipe at the top of the still where it leaves the still. As it's rising up, it's moving away from the heat source, so heavier flavors and compounds like water will condense and rain back down into the pot, and just the alcohol and the finer flavor notes that we're looking for will leave the still. They'll move through a series of copper pipes. We've all seen like those moonshine pictures of a coiled pipe coming off the top of a still. That's called the line arm. So we're moving through this pipe until we get to the condenser. And the condenser is just where that pipe continues through a cold water bath. And what we're looking to do there is cool that steam, that alcohol steam, back down. So when we cool it down, it condenses from a steam back into a liquid, keeps on working through that moonshiner's coil, and it eventually comes out the outlet of the still, what's called the parrot, and that's where we'll collect our refined spirit. So this will take a couple of passes through, depending on what we're making. So one still day will take us from about 6 or 7% alcohol beer to about a 30% alcohol, what's called a low wine, like low alcohol wine. We'll then put that back into the still, distill that through a second day, and that will yield what are called the high wines. And on that run, we're actually going to smell and taste what's coming off the still, and we're going to separate out flavors that we want from flavors and aromas that we don't want. And we make what are called cuts. Those are just, again, separating out flavors by their boiling point. So that will allow us to refine about 400 gallons of beer down to about 50 gallons of high wines, or raw whiskey at that point. It's also called White Dog, things along those lines. White Lightning, probably a term you're familiar with. So that will get loaded into barrels here, and this is where it's going to mature. So in the case of whiskeys and rums, so the brown spirits, brandies as well, those will spend time in oak barrels. The barrels are all charred or toasted on the inside. That's going to change the barrel a little bit, the wood structure, break it down, caramelize some of the wood sugars. So as the alcohol soaks into the barrel, it's going to dissolve some of those compounds from the wood and pick up flavor notes, pick up sweetness. Oak has a lot of natural vanillin in it, so it's going to flavor the spirit. That can be a tough flavor to pick up in spirit. So many other big flavors going on in like a whiskey or something, that vanilla is not one that always jumps out to me. But if you're a wine drinker and you have a sip of red wine and you get that vanilla note, that is the same flavor that is in whiskey, and it's coming from the barrel that the wine or the whiskey or brandy or what have you is stored in. And then we're picking out color as well. So all spirit that comes off the barrel is crystal clear, gin clear. So it picks up all its color from the barrel, flavor compounds, things like that. That process will take us 2 to 5 years, depending on what we're producing. And then when that's all done, we'll harvest a barrel, which means we'll pull it off of our racks here, empty it, and then we'll cut it from barrel strength, which is 125 or more proof, down to our bottling strength, which is usually about 85 to 90 proof, depending on what we're making. And then it gets packaged and off to you, the consumer. Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed yourselves as we explored some of Maine's Prohibition history and speakeasies around the state. Until next time, I'm Ned Wight. Cheers.
Cheers to you, Ned, and cheers to all of the speakeasies and owners who opened their doors, and to all of you for joining us this evening. It's amazing that this history from 100 years ago is still alive today and can still, no pun intended, be experienced by residents and visitors alike. I, for one, have had a great time getting a feel for this aspect of Maine's colorful history. And I certainly don't mind adding a few new drink recipes to my repertoire. We here at Maine Preservation appreciate all of your continued support and look forward to working with you to preserve the downtowns, neighborhoods, and farmsteads which make Maine such a special place. Cheers. It says 1949, a good vintage.
Save a little dram for me. Glory, hallelujah. Why drinking gin ain't against my teaching. Treat me with equality. From this here smell is very plain to see that somebody here's been holding out on me. Oh, forever, and if you want more preaching, save a little dram for me. Now when they passed the bone dry law, I was the very first to say that it never would stay. And neither did I think the law could regulate our faith. That's why I got none stored away. Now, since Prohibition's got us drinks as new